The year was 1847, and England stood at the uneasy edge between the old world and the new. Steam engines screamed across green pastures, factories coughed gray clouds over the towns, and yet within the walled estates of its nobility, time still moved at the pace of a grandfather clock. Ravenshire Manor, grand and decaying, sat like a relic of a forgotten age, a monument of cold stone and colder memories. Its lord, Alaric Montgomery, the Duke of Ravenshire, carried the weight of centuries upon his broad shoulders, yet wore it with the rigid poise expected of his kind. To society, he was an enviable figure, heir to an ancient title, tall, composed, and impeccably mannered. But beneath that still surface lived a silence so profound it frightened even him. The manor's halls spoke for him. Dust lay thick on portraits of ancestors who had governed, conquered, and sinned. The grand piano in the music room had not been opened since his mother's death 5 years past. Servants walked softly, as though afraid to disturb the ghosts that lingered in the corners. Alaric's life had narrowed to duty, ledgers, estates, and the slow, humiliating erosion of his fortune. Pride forbade him to admit how close Ravenshire was to ruin. What he needed was not affection, but an alliance, one that would restore solvency, preserve appearances, and keep his late father's name from mockery. It was his solicitor who first suggested Lady Eveline Whitmore. The daughter of a nobleman once respected in Parliament, she had become a quiet fixture on London's social fringe after her father's investments collapsed. Her dowry remained substantial, her character unmarred by scandal, and her desperation, though politely veiled, was palpable. She was precisely what the Duke required, respectable, well-bred, and willing. When Alaric met her for the first time in the drawing-room of a mutual acquaintance, the encounter was courteous but glacial. Eveline's beauty was the kind that appeared accidental, soft auburn hair arranged with simple elegance, a complexion pale as new parchment, and eyes of startling clarity. Yet behind that gentleness flickered something untamed, intelligence, perhaps, or spirit held too long in restraint. Alaric noticed it, though he pretended not to. She spoke little, listened attentively, and signed the marriage agreement with a steady hand. He admired her composure but mistrusted the warmth he glimpsed beneath it. Their wedding was swift, tasteful, and void of sentiment. London whispered that it was a practical union, which, in truth, it was. As the carriage carried them north through fog and rain toward Ravenshire, Eveline watched the landscape turn from cultivated gardens to wild moors. The closer they drew to her new home, the quieter her husband became. He did not touch her gloved hand, nor offer comfort when the road grew rough. When she at last saw the manor, its windows dark, its turrets draped in ivy, she felt not triumph, but an inexplicable chill. Their arrival was met by a line of solemn servants, their expressions as expressionless as carved wood. The housekeeper led her through echoing corridors, speaking of generations past, of grand banquets, of balls that once filled these rooms with laughter. Eveline smiled politely, though the air itself seemed heavy with mourning. Her husband offered no tour, no conversation, only a few brief words before retiring to his study. She dined alone that evening beneath a chandelier that cast more shadow than light. The days that followed were marked by civility and distance. Alaric treated her with faultless courtesy, yet avoided all intimacy. He attended to estate matters by day and retreated to the library by night. Eveline, left to the company of her embroidery and the sound of the clock's relentless ticking, began to feel more like a guest than a wife. She wrote to her cousin in London of her surroundings, of the moors stretching beyond the gardens, of the smell of old books that clung to the corridors, of the loneliness that crept through even the sunniest mornings. She did not confess that she sometimes dreamed of her husband's eyes, nor that she wondered what storm had turned them so cold. One evening, as rain lashed against the windows, she summoned the courage to ask him what had soured his view of love so completely. They sat in the drawing-room, firelight flickering across his profile. He answered without looking at her. Love is a luxury for men unburdened by history, Lady Ravenshire. You and I are bound by necessity. Nothing more. His voice was calm, deliberate, and final. The words struck her with quiet force. Then I am to be your necessity, she said softly. You are to be my duchess, he replied, rising to end the conversation. And that will be sufficient for both of us. He left her with the crackling fire and a silence that seemed to echo through every wall. Eveline sat motionless, her hands clasped in her lap, feeling the faint tremor of something unnamed within her chest. Not heartbreak, not yet, but the first ache of it. In the days that followed, she studied her husband in the way one studies a portrait, searching for hints of expression beneath the stillness. He was meticulous in his habits, always punctual, always reserved. Yet there were moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when the mask faltered. Once, she found him in the corridor outside the West Wing, staring at a closed door with something like grief in his eyes. When he noticed her, he turned sharply away and muttered that the wing was not to be entered. She obeyed, though curiosity bloomed quietly in her mind. Autumn deepened, bringing with it a chill that seemed to seep from the manor's stones. Eveline took refuge in its vast library, a room lined with shelves that climbed to the ceiling and smelled of dust and forgotten years. It became her sanctuary, a place where she could breathe without pretense. She read everything from poetry to estate ledgers, finding in those pages a companionship denied her elsewhere. It was on a dim afternoon, while exploring the highest shelf, that her hand brushed against a stack of old journals bound in faded leather. They were stored behind a row of theological volumes, as if hidden deliberately. One of them bore a small monogram pressed into the corner, E.M. The initials were unfamiliar, yet the moment she opened the cover, she felt the air around her change. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, and alive with emotion. Eveline read only a few lines before she stopped, unsettled by the intimacy of the words. They spoke of Ravenshire, of longing, of a love that could not be named. She closed the book gently, her pulse quickened not by fear but by recognition, the sense that these pages contained something meant for her, though written long before her birth. That evening, as she joined her husband for dinner, she watched him more closely. He was polite as ever, asking if she had settled into her routines. She almost mentioned the diary, then decided against it. There was something in his expression, a fatigue too deep to be spoken of, that warned her to keep her discovery secret for now. When the clock struck 10 and he retired, Eveline remained by the fire, staring into its glow. She thought of the initials embossed upon the cover, of the emotion trapped within those inked lines, and of the cold man who shared her name but not her heart. She did not yet know it, but the diary she had found would change everything. It would uncover a truth buried in silence, reveal the reason behind her husband's distance, and awaken a love long considered impossible. But for that night, she merely sat listening to the rain against the windows, feeling, for the first time, that the walls of Ravenshire were whispering to her. Morning light crept into the Ravenshire library like a trespasser, gentle but uninvited. The embers in the fireplace had long since turned to ash, yet Lady Eveline remained awake, the mysterious diary resting upon her lap. She had spent the night reading by candlelight, drawn helplessly into the words of another woman, Eleanor Montgomery, the late Duchess, and mother to her husband. The entries began 2 decades earlier, in 1819, written in an elegant, fluid hand that spoke of refinement and suppressed emotion. What began as idle curiosity transformed swiftly into an intimate revelation. Each page unfurled the inner world of a woman who had once lived, loved, and suffered within these very walls. Eleanor's early writings described the same Ravenshire Eveline now inhabited, its vastness, its loneliness, and the way its beauty could suffocate the heart. But as Eveline read on, she encountered something unexpected, a confession of affection for a man not her husband. His name appeared only once, Thomas Reed, a tutor employed to educate the young heir, Alaric, in literature and history. The Duchess wrote of his gentleness, of his passion for poetry, of the way he spoke of life beyond the manor's gates. She wrote of love that began in innocence, then grew into something forbidden. Eveline's hands trembled as she traced the words, each line alive with longing that defied decorum. She paused only when the first rays of sun touched the floor. Closing the diary with care, she pressed her palm against the cover as though feeling the pulse of the woman behind the words. There was pain there, hidden beneath ink and grace, and Eveline could not look upon her husband the same way again. The Duke's coldness, once an affront, now seemed the shadow of something deeper, perhaps shame, perhaps protection. She understood, suddenly, that his silence was not born of arrogance, but inheritance. At breakfast, Alaric found her already seated, her expression thoughtful. He inquired after her rest, and she replied with practiced ease. Yet when she mentioned she had been exploring the library, a flicker of tension crossed his face. His voice, though controlled, lost its warmth entirely. "The library contains family records and private writings best left untouched," he said. "I would prefer you confine your reading to the public shelves." Eveline inclined her head, but her mind raced. The vehemence in his tone was not that of indifference, it was fear. She longed to ask why, to demand what secret he sought to bury, but prudence restrained her. The world of the manor was governed by quiet rules, questions invited walls, and persistence drew fire. That afternoon, unable to resist, she returned to the diary. Eleanor's words spoke of growing torment. The Duchess had written of a love so pure it became unbearable, and of a husband whose affection had long withered into contempt. The more Eveline read, the more the ghost of the Duchess took shape before her eyes, a woman imprisoned by duty, punished for desiring tenderness in a world that prized obedience. One entry stopped Eveline cold. It described the last night Eleanor saw Thomas read. The Duchess wrote of an argument with her husband, the late Duke, who had discovered the affair through intercepted letters. She feared for Thomas's safety. The entry ended abruptly, as if the pen had been torn from her hand. The next page was blank, save for a smear of ink that resembled a tear. Eveline felt her breath quicken. The poet's disappearance had been no mere scandal, it was tragedy, perhaps even sin. When she next saw Alaric, he stood by the window of his study, gazing out across the mist-laden moors. "You avoid the west wing," she said quietly. "Why?" He did not turn. "Because some rooms are better left to memory." "And memory left to dust?" she pressed, emboldened by what she had read. He faced her then, his expression grave. "There are matters you cannot understand, my lady. My family's history is not for your sympathy." "It may not need sympathy," she said softly, "but it deserves truth." For a heartbeat, something flickered in his eyes, a struggle between pride and vulnerability. Then, as always, pride won. "Truth is a luxury my mother could not afford," he said, and walked away. That night, Eveline dreamed of a woman in white wandering the corridors of Ravenshire, clutching a letter to her chest. The woman's face was indistinct, but her sorrow was palpable. When Eveline awoke, her pillow was damp with tears she could not explain. The dream left her with an ache, a compulsion to uncover what truly happened to the Duchess and the poet she loved. In the following days, she scoured the remaining diaries. There were only fragments, letters pressed between pages, unfinished sketches, and a poem written in another hand, likely Thomas's. Its final line read, "If love is treason, let my heart be hanged beside hers." Eveline closed her eyes. The romance had been real, not invention. The Duchess had risked everything, and lost. Her growing sympathy for Eleanor began to alter her feelings toward Alaric. She noticed the rigidity of his posture when his mother's name was mentioned, the bitterness beneath his courtesy, the way he kept his emotions locked behind perfect diction. One evening, as they walked through the gardens, she dared to speak. "I think your mother was braver than she is remembered to be." He stopped, his gaze turning sharp. "You presume much about a woman you never knew." "I read her words," she said, meeting his eyes steadily. "She loved deeply. Perhaps that was her crime." His jaw tightened. "Love destroyed her," he said. "And it nearly destroyed this family. That is all you need to know." Eveline could feel the storm gathering behind his restraint. She wanted to tell him that love had not destroyed his mother, it had freed her spirit, even in sorrow, but she knew such words would only wound him further. Instead, she lowered her voice. "I think you fear becoming what you do not understand." For the first time, he faltered. "And what is that?" "Human," she whispered. He turned away, leaving her alone amid the roses and mist. The following morning, Eveline found his study door locked. The servants whispered that the Duke had not slept, that he had spent the night pacing. Something in him was shifting, she sensed, though whether it would lead to ruin or revelation, she could not tell. She returned to the diary once more, reading its final entry, dated mere weeks before Eleanor's death. "They say a heart can be buried beneath duty, but mine still beats beneath the marble. Should my son ever seek to understand me, let him find me here, among the pages where I dared to be alive." Eveline closed the book, tears stinging her eyes. She felt as though the Duchess spoke directly to her, asking to be remembered not for scandal but for love. Folding her hands over the diary, she whispered, "You will know, I promise." Outside, thunder rolled over the horizon. The manor seemed to tremble in response, as if awakened by the very promise she had made. Eveline looked toward the west wing, its door still forbidden, and knew her search was far from over. The truth lay beyond that silence, and soon, whether invited or not, she would open the door herself. The storm broke over Ravenshire with the violence of a long-held confession. Wind rattled the windows, rain lashed against the ancient glass, and the house seemed to sigh beneath its own history. Eveline stood before the west wing door, candle trembling in her grasp, heart thudding with both fear and resolve. For days, she had resisted the pull toward this forbidden corridor. Now, the promise she had whispered to the late Duchess gave her courage. She pressed the latch, it yielded with a groan. The air that escaped was stale, tinged with decay and the faint scent of lavender, an echo of its last occupant. Inside, the corridor stretched into darkness. Dust cloaked the furniture, and the portraits along the wall were veiled in cobwebs. Eveline moved slowly, her candlelight catching the outlines of forgotten years. At the end of the hall stood a door, half ajar, leading into a chamber untouched since time had abandoned it. Within lay the remnants of a woman's life, a dressing table covered in tarnished silver, a mirror clouded with age, and upon it, a dried bouquet of heather. Eveline's gaze fell to a small locked chest near the hearth. Instinct guided her hand. She drew from her sleeve the hairpin she had worn that morning and pressed it gently into the lock. It gave way with a reluctant click. Inside were letters, yellowed and delicate, bound with a faded blue ribbon. She unfolded one at random, her breath catching as she recognized Eleanor's handwriting, only these words were not addressed to her husband, but to Thomas Reed. The letter spoke of exile. The poet had been dismissed under threat, forced to flee the country to avoid scandal. "They call it justice," the Duchess wrote, "but it is cruelty. I have condemned him by loving him. And yet, my heart will not recant." Eveline read on until tears blurred the ink. The final letter ended abruptly, signed only with the words, "Until the next life, my dearest heart." She replaced the letters with reverence, her mind whirling. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. She turned sharply, and there stood Alaric, rain-soaked, his expression as severe as the storm outside. For a moment neither spoke. His eyes fell to the open chest, then to the candle in her hand. "So," he said quietly, "you've chosen to pry open the ghosts of this house." "I had to know," Eveline answered, her voice trembling but steady. She deserved to be remembered, not hidden. He stepped closer, his gaze unreadable. "You think you understand what she did? My mother's choices destroyed everything she touched. My father's pride, our name, this estate, it all bled because of her weakness." "Her weakness?" Eveline's voice rose, sharpened by disbelief. "You call love weakness?" She loved when her world forbade it. She felt when everyone around her was content to feel nothing. "Love made her miserable," he snapped. "It made her reckless. And when my father found out, he stopped, the sentence strangled by memory." Eveline's breath caught. "He what, Alaric?" He turned away, gripping the edge of the mantle. "He sent the man to the colonies. Paid to have him disappear. She never recovered. I found her in this very room, the night she died. She had written him again. The letter was never sent." The silence that followed was thick with sorrow. Eveline stepped toward him, her voice soft now. "And you've carried his sin as your own ever since." He looked at her then, truly looked, as though seeing her for the first time. "I swore I would never love," he said hoarsely. "Never give another person the power to destroy me as she destroyed him." Eveline's candle flickered, casting her face in trembling light. "Then you've let their tragedy live through you," she said. "You've become the very legacy you despise." His composure broke like glass. "And what would you have me do? Pretend that love redeems what it ruins?" "No," she whispered, stepping closer until only inches separated them. "I would have you see that it is the only thing that endures after the ruin." The storm howled outside as though echoing her words. Alaric's gaze faltered, torn between defiance and longing. His hand lifted slightly, then dropped again, as if restrained by invisible chains. "You speak like her," he said bitterly. "You will end the same." Eveline shook her head. "No, Alaric. I will end this." She moved past him to the writing desk and took a sheet of parchment. With swift, determined strokes, she began copying one of Eleanor's unsent letters, the one addressed to her son. When she finished, she handed it to him silently. "Read it," she said. He hesitated, then obeyed. His eyes moved across the words, Eleanor's apology, her confession, her hope that he might one day forgive what he could not understand. When he reached the end, his hand trembled. For the first time since their marriage, tears shone in his eyes. "She wrote this for me," he murmured, his voice breaking. "She did," Eveline said gently. "And now it has found you." He sank into the chair beside the desk, the letter clutched against his chest. "All these years," he whispered, "I hated her. I thought her betrayal was the reason I could never feel peace. But it wasn't her fault, it was mine, for refusing to see her as human." Eveline knelt before him, her hand resting lightly upon his. "Then let this be the end of it. Let her rest, and free yourself." The wind outside began to calm. The rain softened to a whisper. Alaric looked into his wife's eyes, seeing not pity, but strength, the same courage that had lived in his mother's heart. Slowly, as though surrendering a weapon, he exhaled. "You are nothing like her," he said quietly. Eveline smiled faintly. "No. But I think she would have liked me." A faint laugh escaped him, small, raw, but real. He reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek, his fingers lingering as though afraid she might vanish. "You shouldn't have come here," he said softly. "Perhaps not," she replied. "But neither should your mother's memory have remained buried." They stood together, side by side, the candlelight weaving over their faces. For the first time, the manor felt alive, not haunted, but awakened. Days passed, and the tone of Ravenshire changed. The Duke no longer dined in silence. The study doors remained open. He began restoring the west wing, allowing sunlight to fall upon rooms long entombed in shadow. Eveline continued to read Eleanor's writings aloud in the evenings, and in time, Alaric began to listen, not as a man burdened by shame, but as a son rediscovering his mother. One night, as they walked through the garden beneath a pale moon, Alaric stopped beside the fountain and took her hand. "I told you once this marriage was a matter of necessity," he said. "I was wrong. It has become the only choice I've made that feels alive." Eveline's breath caught, her heart trembling like the water beneath the moonlight. "Then let it be more than convenience," she said softly. "Let it be truth." He bent, his lips brushing hers, hesitant, reverent, like a man learning to live again. When they parted, the night was still, the storm long gone. Ravenshire no longer felt like a tomb. It breathed with memory and love reborn, its halls echoing not with regret but with promise. And though the diary rested once more upon the library shelf, Eveline knew its story had not ended, it had merely changed hands. For in 1847 England, where duty often stifled the heart, a duke and his duchess had defied silence. And within the stone walls of Ravenshire, love, patient, wounded, and true, had at last found its voice.